Hey guys, what's going on? This is John from Friends with Your Benefits. Look, if you've seen some of my previous videos, you may have heard me mention that lifestyle spending accounts, also known as LSAs, are among the hottest benefit topics that are out there. But on the flip side, we're also hearing that we may be entering in a recession, and unfortunately, many tech companies out there are having layoffs, right? So, the question that we're hearing from employers often, are LSAs here to stay? Or are they going to go the way of the defined benefit plan? Joining us today to talk more about that, we have Amy Spurling, the CEO and founder of Compt. Hey, Amy, how's it going? Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, Amy, so glad you're here today. So, Amy, before we get into some of my questions on lifestyle spending accounts, I really want my audience and our audience to get to know you a little bit better, right? So, can you tell our audience a little bit about your background and what it was like starting your own company?
Sure, happy to. So I've been in tech companies for about 20 years. Most of the companies I was in, I was a CFO or a COO, so managing finance and HR in all these companies. I did that. I was a CFO in 2008, so have plenty of battle scars from the 2008, 2009 years. Not my most fun years of my career.
Yeah.
Uh, it was the kind of that managing finance and HR that ultimately drove me to starting Compt. I'm not one of those tech founders that, wants to start 15 different companies. It was more of, I need this piece of software to exist for me to be able to be a CFO or a COO and manage people globally distributed, all the things. But nobody was creating it. And I kept pitching people. I was like engineers trying to get them to build it for me, and the platform just didn't exist. So ultimately I decided to start the company because I saw this huge gap where we just needed to adjust compensation and look at it from a different angle with the way the world works now. And nobody was building the things. So, the team got together and we started building it.
Very cool. What were some of the early challenges that you faced when you actually got your company launched?
I mean, there's always the challenge of funding and trying to raise money. I mean, any tech company, you need a fair amount of capital to be able to get off the ground. So that's always a challenge when you're trying to make sure that you've got enough cash in the bank. And, those early years were, one funding, $25,000 check to the next and making sure that the team was paid for. So that was always a challenge. But honestly, on the customer side, we had really great early customer adoption. We still have the first customer we ever signed on the platform, and they joined in January
Really?
of 2018. Yeah. And so
Wow.
it's just been a pretty incredible run for us where we know we're building the right thing for the market and for the way people work. And so that's been very rewarding as we've kind of grown over the last 5 years.
Certainly interesting. And one thing that you mentioned earlier that I want to just circle back to, right? So you mentioned 2008, and that was just a really, really tough year for the economy and
Yeah,
people in general, right? So I've
it's
heard some
awful.
analysts out there kind of compare 2023 to 2008, and we may be entering in a recession, right? We started off the show by talking about some of the tech layoffs that we've all heard about. What's your
Mhm.
perspective on this?
I don't think it's the same as 2008. So there's some pretty big differences between those two kind of markers in the economy. For one, unemployment, entirely different. We were at 11% unemployment in 2008. We're at 3% right now. So right now we have 2 million people looking for jobs and 11 million open jobs.
Hmm.
Entirely different. So in 2008, CFOs ruled everything. Like our job was
Yeah.
just to make sure our companies survived. And what ended up happening was we cut everything. You cut
Hmm.
people, you cut compensation, you cut benefits, you cut deep and as fast as you could because you needed to just survive. Things are very different now. You don't have those same places to be able to cut. But a lot of companies also, because the internet's different than it was in 2008 as well, it's a lot more ubiquitous. Twitter literally, I think, started in 2008. So there was just a lot less discussion happening. Like companies weren't as prepared as they are right now as well. Like there's been speculation about this for a long time. So companies have been trying to kind of navigate this for a while. So we've got a lot more resilience, I think, in the market.
Interesting. And Amy, no, I definitely appreciate your perspective on that. And, certainly just, obviously living through it, I mean, it's huge, right? So I think that's something that is definitely worth noting. So, as it relates to lifestyle spending accounts, right?
Mhm.
A lot of my clients out there and prospects are kind of looking at it and saying, "Hey, John, I kind of like the concept, but you do the math, and this can be millions of dollars if you happen to have a larger organization." And gee, I mean, like we don't necessarily have that money, right? We kind of got to manage the cash on hand. How do you actually convince employers out there that, hey, it is actually worth making the investment in LSAs, or maybe is there another way to look at it?
So I think the way to look at it is, do you need something at all? So if you don't have trouble attracting talent and don't have trouble retaining talent, why pay for something else? You shouldn't. That is not many companies. Those companies should be on
Yeah.
all the podcasts so that we learn how you don't need to attract and retain talent. That would be great. That would be a very short podcast series. If you are in that category, then you've got to figure out, all right, so what do we have to do to be able to either better retain or to attract talent if we are struggling with that? You have to look at your salaries first. Are you competitive against whatever your competitive set is? Because if you're not, there's nothing else you're going to do. You are never going to get that talent. If your salaries are competitive, then you got to look at health insurance. Depending on your industry, it's an expectation in a lot of industries. Not every industry, but in a lot of industries, it's an expectation. If you aren't offering that, that's the next big bucket you got to tackle. And if you're doing both of those things, then the question is, all right, with this last little 15, 20% of compensation, what are you going to do to differentiate from all your competitors who already also have salaries and health insurance?
Mhm.
So if you have to look at that, then the question is, all right, what's going to be the most cost effective and what's going to get the highest utilization? And that's where LSAs win every single time, because there's no other way to approach this and get the level of utilization that you can get across the team especially for the lowest dollar amount, than on LSA. That is the fastest, easiest way to do this. So you really have to answer those first two questions first.
Have you seen any companies out there try to find creative ways to fund the LSAs, maybe with redirecting dollars they're currently spending today? And if so, what have you seen that's actually worked?
Sure. So a lot of companies have, different employee benefits that are sitting over in this last 15, 20%. It could be a gym reimbursement. It could be a cell phone reimbursement, internet. They may be doing some things in wellness. They may be offering a bunch of, childcare and student loan forgiveness and like a whole bunch of things, right? When they go and look at the actual utilization, they're going to find it's very, very low. So especially for
Mhm.
those point solutions, 3 to 5% of the team is going to use, a gym reimbursement. You're going to find very low uptick on fertility benefits. These are still great things, but when you're looking at paying so much money for so few people to use it, it just doesn't make sense. Whereas you could say, hey, take all of that, take, a fraction of what you're spending there, offer it to the team and say, we support wellness. But now instead of paying for 20 things, you've shrunk your budget and you've made it a lot more effective for your team. So it's a lot less expensive overall when you start looking at it from that angle.
So, one thing that I've kind of seen, and I want your perspective on this. So, my personal perspective is if you've seen one LSA vendor, you've seen one LSA vendor. And some of them will happen to have an online marketplace where people can go and they can actually purchase products. Others will say, "Hey, John, here's a debit card." And others will
Mm-hmm.
say, "Okay, you upload this receipt and we'll do some sort of paycheck reimbursement, what have you." What's Comp's philosophy on how the LSA should work and why?
So I do think that it depends on a company. So I think there's value in all three of those models, depending on your company. We obviously have a pretty um, strong perspective on the reimbursement model because that's the way we operate, and we designed in as a reimbursement quite intentionally. So for us, this works really well for customers that are focused on tax compliance, because marketplaces are not going to be tax compliant. A lot of these things are taxable income for employees.
Mhm.
Debit cards, I'm a former CFO. I do not want a third party holding all of my cash in their account, which you typically have to do with these debit cards. I'm not
Mhm.
doing that. So for me, as if I put my CFO hat on, it's okay, how do I make sure I'm tax compliant, budget compliant, and I know where my money is? And that's where reimbursements get very interesting. You also can get better utilization with a reimbursement model. So
Hmm.
a marketplace typically has couple hundred different vendors, for example. That feels like choice for employees, but they typically get 30 to 40% utilization across that marketplace. For us, for the last 4 years, we've been at 91% employee utilization, meaning 91% of the people on our platform have used their employee perks. You can't beat us in the market. And so we actually went and looked at how many vendors that represented, because we're like, okay, maybe we should build a marketplace. People talk about these things. And we looked at a sample of 8,700 of our users. We watched them for 12 months. And we saw, okay, great, 12 months, 8,700 people. We had this really high utilization. So how many different unique vendors did they use in that time period? And what we found is that they used 27,000 different vendors. Like on average,
Wow.
every person wants 3 different things. You can't build that.
Sure.
You just can't build that. And if you did, no one's scrolling through all those vendors to find the 3 that they want. So you have to take a different approach if your objective is to reach everyone, which it should be if you're putting a program like this in place, because that's how you impact your retention and retraction.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I honestly did not know that. That's definitely a lot of vendors out there. So, yeah, certainly interesting perspective, Amy. One that we'll have to perhaps touch on in a little more detail at a later date. So, really, where do you see the future of LSAs going over the next 3 to 5 years? And also, where do you see comp going?
I think the two are on the same path, because I think LSAs are going to become more and more critical as a compensation strategy. Companies have to find things that are cost effective. Whether we're in a recession or not, you still need to make your dollars work for you as a company. You also need to get that really high engagement. And if you're doing this in a way that, you've got all these vendors that are getting 3%, you just don't get the engagement across the team. You have to focus on high engagement and trying to reach that level of personalization. That's an employee's expectation. Every app on our phones is personalized to our own preferences. Everyone is expecting personalization in their jobs and the flexibility. Our compensation should be the same.
So, Amy, let's say there's an employer out there, right? And they want to learn more about comp. Perhaps they want to connect with you directly. Where can they go to learn
Sure.
more information?
Well, they can certainly email me, amy@compt, compt.io, or check out our website, compt.io. And I'm happy to chat with them. Happy to, give them a tour, connect them with the team, anything they'd like.
Awesome. No, Amy, really appreciate your perspective and where you think the future of LSAs are going. For our audience out there, we really want to hear from you guys. If you're an employer, is an LSA something that you envision you can offer to your workforce perhaps in the next 3 to 5 years? And if so, what do you think that potentially could look like? Comment below. As always, we encourage you to subscribe, like the video, and until next time, thank you for joining. And Amy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure being here.